This presentation will discuss the main characteristics and implications of Down syndrome and the effects these implications have on a person with Down syndrome's motor development in relation to dynamic systems theory. It will also discuss how having Down syndrome can affect a student's learning and review certain teaching implications that may assist the teacher to further the path for that student to succeed in schooling. Down syndrome is a birth defect that, according to the World Health Organization, occurs in approximately 1 in 1,000 births around the world. Down syndrome is triggered by the trisomy of chromosome 21, which means that there is an additional chromosome present at conception. There are 3 factors that influence whether trisomy or division of cells will occur. These include age of the mother, already having a child with Down syndrome, or being carriers for the genetic translocation for Down syndrome. Down syndrome is one of the most prominent causes of an intellectual disability. People who have Down syndrome also face a host of other potential health issues, such as issues with learning and memory, Alzheimer's disease, leukemia, and other cancers and congenital heart disease. Down syndrome can be characterized by a range of complex phenotypic features, some of which include short stature, hypertonia, morphological abnormalities of the head and limbs, and hyperlaxity of ligaments. Motor development begins at birth. Infants with typical development will interact with their surroundings with a series of motor behaviors that include spontaneous reactions and movements. Usually these are towards a visual or auditory stimulus. These movements that children make in the very beginning are an early manifestation of a range of motor actions that will be essential later in life. Gross motor skills which emerge in the first few months of life contribute to the acquisition of other motor and cognitive skills later in their life. Motor development is assessed at multiple points in a child's life. These assessments can identify if there are any needs for intervention, if the child is at risk for motor delays, and guide treatment plans to minimize these delays. Studies show that children with Down syndrome are often more delayed in the acquisition of new motor skills than a child with typical development. In infants with Down syndrome, it can be seen that their head riding and protective reactions, such as the extension of arms to protect them from falling, are significantly impaired. It is evident that all developmental goals that a child with typical development would display are significantly delayed in that of a child with Down syndrome. It is also evident that the older the child gets, the slower the acquisition of gross motor skills would be. The reasoning behind this could be due to the fact that as children get older, the difficulty of performing complex motor skills increases. This, in turn, becomes more of a challenge for children with Down syndrome to complete these skills at the same rate as children their same age with typical development, particularly due to their problems with postural control. It is indicated that because the delay begins to grow larger between children with typical development and those with Down syndrome in relation to motor skills development, that the earlier a child receives intervention, the better chance they have at reaching milestones with minimal delay.
The dynamic systems theory is a model that can be applied to students with Down syndrome. This model aims to explain how movement behaviors emerge. There are 3 variables that underpin this theory, which are the task, the individual, and their environment. The interaction and relationship between these variables allow us to explain how certain movements are produced in specific contexts. Using the dynamic systems theory, we are able to understand and identify how within the key variables there are constraints that limit the range of movements and affordances that permit certain methods of movement. Constraints can be manipulated by teachers to promote motor development of children. When applying the dynamic systems theory in a specific context, there are 4 key focus areas to look at. These include the goal of the movement, such as standing up from a seated position or catching and retaining possession of a ball. The second key area is self-organization, and this looks at the physical, emotional, and environmental factors to do with the task, such as motivation, the affordances to learn the movement, and being in physical position, such as catching a ball. The third key area is transitions. Now, The transitions are a reduction in success and they promote development in the long term. For example, first you learn to catch a ball, and then you will learn to catch a ball when it's low and high, going fast, or in a specific direction. The final key area are the rate limiters. Now these are what have to happen before a movement is permitted, such as walking before the ability to run. We will now look at how the dynamic systems theory can be applied for a student with Down syndrome in the context of a game of Tiggy. The goal of the movement in Tiggy is to avoid being tagged whilst running around. When tagged, the goal of the movement then changes to run and tag another player. This task provides constraints to students with Down syndrome as their ability to run and quickly change directions may not be as well developed as typical students within the game of Tiggy. When looking at the self-organization area of the model, there are many physical, emotional, and environmental factors at play. There are a range of subsystems which place constraints on students with Down syndrome. For example, emotionally, the students with Down syndrome need to have the motivation to want to avoid being tagged or to tag others. It is also a social environment with other students and the teacher, which impacts on the emotions and motivation of the student. Physically, they are required to challenge other students who may have typical motor development when it comes to running or quick changes in direction. When transitioning, the students will first need to mature the movement of walking. This is a fundamental movement which will develop into the skill of running. For this to occur, the student will need affordances and resources which will help the subsystems to develop and aid in maturing these skills, such as balance, strength, and muscle tone. Finally, we can discuss the rate limiters which impact on how a learner moves when applied to the game of Tiggy. Due to the natural delay in movements such as walking, movements such as running and balance become rate limiters. Also, leg and arm strength for quick movements when you're running and changing direction in Tiggy when trying to avoid and tag also become rate limiters.
In Australia, there are many articles of legislation and policy that are available to guide teachers towards effective practices in inclusive education. The Disability Discrimination Act is in place to prevent the discrimination of a person with a disability in all contexts. This stops all students from being discriminated against or excluded due to their disability. This includes in schooling. Another vital policy document that may provide a guide for teachers in educating students with additional needs is the Inclusive Education Policy, which states that students should have access to learning and be able to fully participate in the learning. In order to provide the inclusive education to students with Down syndrome, teachers must differentiate curriculum and learning and make the necessary adjustments to have that child succeed in their classroom. For students with Down syndrome, this may include, but not be limited to, having an education support worker who is able to provide specific attention and guidance to a particular student. The Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, Standard 1.1, states that teachers must know their students and how they learn, which includes knowing their physical, social, and intellectual development and characteristics of the student. It is apparent that evidence-based practice is the most effective teaching tool that an educator who is teaching anyone with a disability can have. Teachers should be encouraged to use information based on the student's disability to inform planning of lessons and assessment for that student. Another implication that teachers may encounter is having to communicate and liaise with people outside of the school in relation to the student, including medical professionals and parents.
There are necessary implications and considerations for students with Down syndrome which can help support and enhance development throughout practical lessons. By altering games, rules, and learning tasks to cater for all students, a learning environment with equitable and equal opportunity can be made. In the context of Tiggy, a student with Down syndrome could be in a more equitable environment by playing in a smaller zoned area where equal participation can take place. This also relates to what Farragher and Clark said, which is that the learner needs to be in control and in the driver's seat. This means allowing them to participate and including them in an environment that will foster motivation and is not too challenging.